So I've already asked you guys this question, but I'm going to ask the adults too. Have you ever been tempted in your life? Yes, okay, good. Not that I'm glad to hear that more of us have been tempted. Not necessarily that we are tempted, but I'm glad I'm not alone. There are a lot of things that tempt us, right? And one of my biggest temptations in life comes to food. It is my biggest struggle, and if you put a piece of pizza in front of me, I cannot resist. Stephanie will attest to that. I cannot resist pizza. There's a few other things, like ice cream, things that I shouldn't be eating, right? For me, it feels like there's a veritable parade of things that we are told we shouldn't be doing in our lives, and a lot of them are food related. I see the commercials on TV, and there's commercials for all kinds of pastries and fried foods and everything else that beckons us to come and to eat. But there is something in my life that truly is one of those temptations I struggle with on a day-to-day basis. And it doesn't have to do with food, believe it or not. It's procrastination. Okay, I'm glad I'm not alone in that one either. If I have this project that I'm just feeling overwhelmed about, I often sit there and go, you know what, it'll wait till tomorrow. The problem is if when I wait till tomorrow and I try to pick it up tomorrow, I'm looking at it going, I should have started this yesterday, right? Or I should have done it yesterday. It's not so much the procrastination that gets me in trouble, it's giving into that temptation to put it aside, to put aside things that I should be doing on a regular basis. And there are a lot of temptations in this world. Those are just two really simple ones. But there is often times when we are pushed to face how honest we truly are with one another, to test us to see how faithful we can be to our spouses or our partners. Or how about the temptation or willingness to throw a friend under the bus in order to save our own skin? Or worse, to make ourselves look better. Then, of course, there's the temptation for filing your taxes inappropriately, or tithing, or stealing, and more. And that list goes on, doesn't it? This world has an easy time in tempting us to do things that are not necessarily good for us or for the community at large. And unfortunately, we live in a world that is full of those. It kind of reminds me of the statement, and maybe you've heard this before, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? I mean, what exactly does that mean? It doesn't take a rocket scientist, right, to figure out what they're trying to say. But the temptation to push beyond, to transgress boundaries is ever present, isn't it? Sometimes the boundaries we are tempted to cross are minor. They're not going to get us in a lot of trouble, but sometimes they have serious consequences. And I don't need to tell you that the world is falling over its collective commercial impulse to dangle things in front of us like the ever-present carrot to lead us in the wrong direction. Every day there are temptations to cheat, to lie, to seek revenge, and to manipulate the system so that we can get what we think we deserve. It's like a vast sea in which we all swim, some better than others. The ironic thing about this is, though, that the world had less technology in Jesus' day, and yet the same temptations existed. They were just as prevalent for him and his disciples as they are for us today. I mean, if you think about the story that we heard about Jesus in the desert, it takes us back to a time that is much simpler, right? Not that daily impulse to pick up our phone or our tablets, to step away from things for a moment. Jesus was in the desert by himself. The story that Luke tells us happens just after Jesus is baptized in the Jordan by John. And the way that Luke tells us, Jesus is led by the Holy Spirit to enter into the desert and faces a time of temptation and fasting. The first temptation that the devil offers to Jesus is based upon his appetite, right? The devil says to him, I know you're hungry. Go ahead, turn those stones into bread. And how many of us, when we're hungry, would love to take an and I got to slow down, would take one of those objects and turn it into something that we can consume, right? I mean, have we ever been that ravenous in our lives where we like to say, I could eat a horse? Right? This is the kind of hunger that Jesus has. And to me, that's the idea of being able to take an object and turn it into something to eat is an amazing prospect. One that might even appeal to our fuzzy feel-good feelings of today, right? We know how Jesus responded, though. He says, one does not live by bread alone. Think about that. Despite how hungry he was, he resisted the temptation to satisfy his physical hunger because it is merely physical. And then the devil thinks, I wonder if power would entice this guy into stepping out and cheating on God. And so comes the lure of power. Now, from the halls of government to the churches that we serve in and live in, power attempts to seduce and lure us away from what is truly right and just all the time. Unfortunately, this is the one that trips up even the most faithful of people. And many fall. But Jesus resists. He says, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. Now, what a concept that is. Serve only God. And I wonder what would happen in this world if more people actually walked the talk of the talk they talk. Then there's this final temptation that Luke presents to us where Jesus is tempted to test his own I can't say the word this morning, immortality, in a dramatic leap from the pinnacle of the temple. Now, how many of us have ever tripped and fallen? How many of us would like this invisible hand to reach out and hold us up so that we don't fall, right? This is what the devil is asking Jesus to do. Now, that's a simple trip and fall, one that we may not die from, but this is from the pinnacle of the temple, the highest place in Jerusalem, probably several stories above the ground. And the devil is telling him, look, if you jump off of this, God has already promised that you would not be hurt. And Jesus resists one last time. And his response is, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, those are the three temptations that he faces. Those are physical, they are power, and they are immortality. The three things that we think of most about Jesus. But the interesting part of this story is not so much his resistance, although that's really important for us to see and understand. It's the fact that the devil doesn't quit. He doesn't give up. If you listened very carefully to the end of that passage Mike read for us, he says, okay, I'll stop for now. It says, until another opportune time appears. Now imagine that. The devil is not giving up entirely. He's given him three temptations, but I'll stop for now. And it seems the question that's before us is not whether or not we're tempted. The real question has to do with how we respond to temptation. And it's our response to those temptations in our lives that either creates us or destroys us. So how do we in the 21st century respond to temptation in our lives? What I've come to learn is that there are likely three basic ways to respond to temptation. The first is simply to give in to it, right? We can give in to those temptations. God knows I've given in to that slice of pizza more than once. The language that accompanies us in this, though, is justification. And that's the first response. We are really good at justifying our actions, aren't we? Maybe you've heard these words. Well, everyone else is doing it. Or, I'm far from perfect, it's okay for me to do this. Or one I heard just the other day, which goes something like this. Well, if I don't do it, someone else is just going to do it for them. Sound familiar? Yeah. So what difference does it make? Well, here's the other thing that I've learned. Succumbing to temptation is also an epidemic in our world. If you think about that for a moment, do you know someone who surrenders their integrity to temptation and is easy to defend themselves, to articulate why something they have done is reasonable and acceptable? Do you know anybody like that in your lives? I think I might know a few folks that create justification for just about anything that they do. And unfortunately, the more we do that, the more we move away from God's love. But before we get too righteous, we also need to hold the mirror up. I justify myself a lot. But that's one of the things I'm working on this Lent. Helping myself to recognize the justifications that I make. All right, so that's justification. Then there's this idea of accommodation. And accommodation happens when we submit to the notion that it's really not that bad. How many of us have ever thought that before? And this is the attitude where we just kind of shrug our shoulders a little bit. You know, if you want to get along, you have to get along. Go along with others. Giving into temptation to avoid conflict or wiggle ourselves to a safe distance is just as wrong as justifying what we're doing. It's a way of dealing with temptation that also allows us to become mired in a swamp of relativity. We look no different than anyone else, and I think that's where we're getting into trouble. This is the process of refusing to take a stand and saying, rather than everyone's point of view is valid, but let's talk through our differences, we say, oh, well, that just means everybody's okay. If given a point of view leans into murdering whole populations, are we going to go along with it? If we lean into the idea that something is wrong because everybody else is doing it and discussing it over tea, is that right? There's a difference between being able to see different points of view and just going along because it's the popular thing to do. You mean clearly on this. Just going along because it's the popular thing to do is giving in to temptation. And then there's this third way. The way that I think we as a community, we as Christians need to be looking at temptation, and that's the way of Christ. In the passage before us, the devil puts him to the test with serious moves. And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? Where we learn from the master how to handle life. He's offered abundant food when he's famished. He's offered political power, and it's laid at his feet. He's also given the opportunity to be the ruler of the world. Our own strength and consolation in struggles that we face hourly can be overcome by doing exactly what he does. In him, there's no surrender or accommodation. There's no giving in. In him, there's no interior struggle with the tyranny of desires. In him is a clear and simple refusal to give in to temptation. It doesn't imply that such resistance is easy or even cost-free, because God knows resisting that slice of pizza is difficult. It takes strength. It takes energy. It takes commitment. It takes clarity of mind and heart to simply say no. And as many of us can probably attest, those two letters are often hard to say, right? Even harder to fully commit to. But the thing is, there are those who have been able to do that throughout history, and they make up a long list of martyrs that is long and illustrious. And we here today tread water in a sea of endless temptations. Yes? but we do so in the presence of a mighty cloud of witnesses who have been able to say no. I'm here today to reassure us that we can take into our hearts that full humanity of Jesus and understand and know that he understood what we go through. I'm here to assure us that the many frail and imperfect people who have gone before us and followed him did the exact same thing. We can take heart in the support of a Christian community who in prayer and worship and discipline stands beside us through all things. We can take heart in the relationships that we build together where we support one another in a shared and sacred resistance to the temptations of this world. And so I want to encourage us this Lenten season to renew our resistance to the temptations around us. But let us also renew our resistance to the oppression wherever we may find it. To regain our stature in this world in the ones who rise up with courage and with joy, because that's what Jesus teaches us to do. And I think I'm going to leave it there for this morning. Amen.